Good morning. My name is Miranda Schroers. I am Professor of Environment and Climate Policy at the Technical University of Munich and also Vice Chair of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Councils and member of the Catalonian Sustainable Development Council as well. And I am very happy to welcome you today to our day 2 of the conference dealing with digitalization and sustainable development, the twin challenge facing the European Union and other regions of the world. This is our annual conference, and we're very happy to welcome a broad audience of member councils of the EEAC network, as well as many other guests that are watching today through our virtual conference. We're learning a lot about how we do digitalization, in part because of the corona crisis, because of the need to live a little bit differently these days, as we all know that we also have to be careful of health concerns. So today we have a very exciting program in front of us. We will be having a number of speakers. We will be looking at issues that we started to talk about yesterday, the role of digitalization, the role of ethics and the challenges associated with digitalization, the questions of how digitalization can help us move forward with meeting the challenges associated with climate change, biodiversity loss, resource use, as well as the questions that are associated with economic inequalities and the need to bring everybody on board. We talked about the participatory elements of digitalization and making sure that the development of algorithms, the development of artificial intelligence capacities is connected to the sustainability transitions in a way that takes on the concerns of societies. And we also discussed the roles that governments play, and particularly the role of the European institutions, as well as the role of national and local governments in thinking about this transition. Today we will deepen our discussion. We have several presentations that we'll have this morning. We'll begin with the presentations. Then we will have a question and answer period, and there will also be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So we would very much like it if you ask questions. We have a team sitting here that's prepared to take on your questions and share them with me so that we can bring them into the discussion. So with these short opening words, I'd like to get us started. And our first speaker will be joining us from the Netherlands, Pallas Agterberg, who is Strategy Director from Alliander. And they're also a member of the Dutch Council for Environment and Infrastructure, RLI. We're very happy to have Pallas with us today, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion on digitally sustainable. What instruments do we need? Taking a look into a discussion that we started yesterday about questions of the role of governments and how governments need to make sure that this digital transition moves smoothly. So Pallas, we're very happy to have you here. Welcome.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here too. The environmental space is something, the physical environment is something that we all know, and that's where we come from. And most of the councils that we make are explicitly about this physical environment. And yet there is a digitization. And what does that mean? If we look at it from a governmental perspective, until recently, we also have seen digital and ICT as a specific sector, which is an industry with computers and everything, phones. And it's a tool, so you can use it in a certain way. And this approach of just looking at it from these technical perspectives is really not enough. So I think this is also the reason why this digital twin conference is here today, because we all feel and see that there's something else going on And in this commission, we had some input from different disciplines of science, and we really wanted to go to the deeper part of it. So please, next slide. So what is actually the difference? And it's not just a tool or an industry, it's a way that society is being organized. So we wanted to go deeper, and beyond the physical environment, we see platforms and we see services. And these, well, it's not that new insight, but if you go a little bit deeper, then you see all kind of things happening. And physical environment at the bottom, and in between there's platforms, and on the top there's services, and these are connected through data. And just like algorithms, like you discussed yesterday, it's both in the platform, like an algorithm that creates a certain result and there's algorithms in the services. For instance, a platform is, I can use the Uber example. A platform is where demand and supply can come together. Suppose you are a person that wants to have a taxi, then you can connect to the platform of Uber. Or suppose you have a car, you can connect to the platform of Uber, and both are coming together. And in the Uber platform, there are all kinds of algorithms that make decisions. But also when a certain service is delivered, for instance, taxi drive, Uber has both the service and the platform. Then then of course there's this price and all kind of other things, like for instance the way you are suppose you are a driver and you want to know whether a person has a good history. That's also part of this platform, and by doing that you see that in this whole new field it's about values, about for instance, is it an open access, these services, is this platform open to everybody that wants to deliver a service? So you see, this is a new field, and then the big question is, how do we as a government need to look at this? What are the instruments, and what are, is it necessary to organize something? And can you do that? What are your instruments? We look at this new way of how society is organized. Then step by step, I go through it and come with perspectives on how to relate to this new way. So of course, in the physical environment, there is digitalization can really help in creating alternatives. And I think today here, we are the big example of it. So instead of all flying to Barcelona, we sitting at home or near home, and we have created a perfect alternative for a polluting activity. And well, this is new, of course. In the last 2 years, we all have learned to use that. But if we start looking at our policies, for instance, for mobility, there's a lot to be done in this area, and but there's so much more that we could do than we are doing just today. Please, the next one. The first one was the very obvious one. So now it's becoming more and more complex because, well, the next thing is that this is really a new thing. The standards that are developed for handling the data is not just about sustainability. It's how do you look at the government? Is the government the one that needs to define standards, or is the sector the one that needs to define standards? And if you do so, then what kind of criteria will you use? This is a really hot topic right now. And if you look, for instance, at circularity in construction, circular construction means that, well, there is a need for use of materials that have been used before, or if you create a building, you can add the information that's necessary to reuse it in a later stage, decades from now. And another way of looking at it is if you have a construction site, then there could be a rule that's a certain percentage of the used materials will be circular, and these all require data, and they all require standards, because if you are a construction company, a small one, for instance, could never create all the data without using standardized software or standardized solutions. And if it's not standardized on a national level or even EU level, then it's very difficult to have access to the market from a construction organization perspective. But it's also in the whole procurement or licensing, it can be an issue because, well, is it an open market? Is it accessible to everybody? But also, is there transparency of what is being done? And as a government, can you really can you create policies that create the data? So if you don't standardize, you are in fact without any instruments. So this is a new area to go in, and we were having these discussions last quarter with the sector of construction and the government that needs to create standards. And we are about to start a process where this sector is invited to come up with some ideas on standardization, even with deadlines when to produce them. And these deadlines and procedures will be created by the government, the national government, in order for the sector to have these steps. And in fact, this organizing the standards instead of setting the standards was an outcome of the discussion for all parties very welcome. So we are still at the start. So let's see what's happening. Can we go to the next slide, please? And then this is really a difficult one, because if you have a platform, and what is a platform? I use the example of Uber. We all know Airbnb, which is an example I will use now. Airbnb is a platform where also demand and supply comes together. And well, I live in Amsterdam. Amsterdam has quite some issues with rental of individual apartments because of the effect was that lots of houses were only available on Airbnb or Airbnb-like companies, and the whole city, the way people can use their houses and live in their houses, or the streets, or the way tourists are divided over the city, was not anymore decided on City Hall, but by Airbnb. So, and I think Barcelona, where some of you are right now, has had the same problem. And these cities started to discuss with Airbnb about rules. And one of these rules is a maximum of 30 days to rent your space instead of a whole year. And some other elements on that. And it has been started, and Airbnb has been very willing to cooperate. So these rules are there right now, and there's even a way of getting, well, somebody needs to control whether this rule is being followed by the renter or not. And then this difficult part comes in, because it's all voluntary. Airbnb does this voluntary. And in this specific example, Airbnb headquarters in Amsterdam, where they really are, they have a phone number, and you can phone them and you can email them, and they really you can have a personal discussion. But a lot of these platforms are tending to be anonymous, so you cannot call them anymore. So this is really something that needs to be addressed at the EU level. That if you have a platform, and can be a new service added, in this case, renting a tourist apartment. What kind of requirements will you set, not only on the quality of the apartment in this example, but also on these rules for not intervening with the way housing is being organized in the city. And if you don't have a legal starting point, this would be very difficult. And it's not just about sustainability when we're talking about, it's about the way we organize society as a whole. And this specific element was discussed very long in the committee, because this is new. This is not something governments are willing to do right now, and they even cannot do it. And this is where also this requirement, what is a platform? A platform is different than just a company. Is Uber a taxi company or a platform? And if they, well, the solution right now in some countries is that they're just seen as a taxi company. And for Uber, this could be argued because they are really having so much influence on services delivered. But there are some platforms that only give access to demand and supply. And this requires a new type of looking at the legislation on this part. So this is really something that needs to be developed. Next slide, please. And then another example that we had here in Amsterdam was that it really felt like a good solution to have sharing bikes. So a share economy for bikes. We do have a lot of bikes, and the idea was that instead of everybody having one or two bikes, if you start sharing them, it's easier, and we will have less issues with all these bikes in the city. But the opposite happened. Within 2 weeks, there were bikes lying everywhere in the parks, on the streets, and nobody cared for them anymore. And in this case, it was possible just to stop the service and redefine rules. But this was an easy one, you can see that, but would it be necessary to have some kind of check before a service comes to the market, an ex ante service instead of afterwards? And in the speed of things and the high impact that can raise from a new service, this would be an instrument needed in the near future. Because if you wait and then, well, bikes is easy, but if it's like highly polluting, or well, it could even create a traffic jam, not just with the bikes, but with other type of solution, a traffic jam with very high consequences. Or in energy, for instance, you could create a service where for flexibility services, well, there's a lot of energy at a certain moment. You start a new service like an aggregator. It's a new thing that's being developed. For instance, starting to load cars, millions of cars in the near future, all at the same time. As a consequence, we would have a blackout because of solving a flexibility issue. And if you can control this ex ante, you will have this blackouts because of it. So this is an instrument that needs to be developed, not to be used too often, but it would be a solution. The experiments. Well, I'm talking about these platforms in data and algorithms and all kind of, in fact, new ways of addressing things. And you can look at the industries who are coming up with services and ideas, but why not trying out themselves? For instance, if you have a highway with this, there is a lot of traffic jam every day, maybe you can come up with a game or with tokens or a system where people can exchange their access to, can buy their access to this road or exchange their access that they already bought and create a kind of possibility to organize themselves in a new way, whether or not they will be on that highway on that specific time, and then be part of the traffic jam or not, and even solving the traffic jam by using this new kind of tools. It's not easy, but we've seen an experiment using this type of ideas, and I think a lot of new experiments could be done, and it's just a way of starting them, and try out, and let's see what's happening. Next one, please. So now we've been discussing the platform, and the platform, of course, is the most powerful one because this is where all things come together. But in the end, what people see is the services delivered. And one I read today that with success, there has been a new requirement for energy service providers, those who deliver energy, that they will give the information on the source of their energy, how gray or green is their energy. It's very simple one, but this is a requirement you can set on almost, this is a digital service because they need to have a source, they need to add it up, and they need to be transparent and then publish it. It's very obvious that it would help for customers to make their choices on what energy service provider they want to have. But this is something you can do with very much more kind of services. For instance, we're looking at a screen right now. This means that some data center is working. And do you know how green the data center is? Or did you, I think this is Zoom, this could be Teams, this could be, well, Google Meets. Are there differences between them? And in all kind of services that you require from a digital perspective, can you see how green how much energy a certain algorithm or certain task needs? The developers, the programmers of the code, they really don't look at it. So maybe it could be something to create requirements on how much energy a certain tool or even a certain part of the program is using. And by making that clear, a lot of things can happen. Well, I gave some examples about the transparencies and the monitoring, and also difficulties in it, because until now we lack some legislation where sometimes where transparency or the use of data is clear, and well, the source of data. So this is a new area in a way, because, well, for some items we have been doing this, but in a real digital environment, we really need to learn more about how to create good monitoring. This is not an easy one but something we just need to start with. Next one, please. So in order to do that, and there's this difficult part again, when we talk about this platform economy and this platform type of solutions, we see that they work in a completely different way. If Facebook, for instance, wants to have an update, it will take them 2 weeks maybe, or sometimes just a day, or even just an hour, it depends on what it is, which is so much faster than we work in governmental areas. And in this high speed, this rapid speed, the way we are addressing things, especially when it's like we do things the same as mid-19th century, with letters and procedures and time. So we need to create new ways of being in line with the speed of society. And it's not only about the monitoring, it's also about knowing what's happening, knowing what kind of impact a certain service has, and especially when it's leading to blackouts or extremely polluting situations, you need to have a swift response, and we are not ready to that. So we need to define agile working methods. Next one, please. And of course, well, this is the easy one. Just share your expertise, and let's do this together. So I've been addressing the different perspectives on how to address this new digital society and what we can do in it. And some of the items are there and just need to elaborate, and some of them are requiring new type of legislation and a new way of looking at things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pallas. That was a very nice introduction into thinking about how do we take sustainability and integrate it into the very rapidly emerging platforms, the new economy that's emerging around them, and thinking about unintended consequences, how to prepare for them and maybe avoid as many as possible. But before we go into questions and answers, I'd like to first take our next speaker on, and then we'll come back to you after Aaron Best has a chance to do his presentation. I'm happy to welcome Aaron Best, who is Senior Fellow Economist and an expert in sustainability issues working at the Ecologic Institute, an important environmental think tank based in Berlin. With offices also internationally. And his talk is dealing with the digital sustainable world, a new economic approach, and looking at the twin challenges associated with this. So Aaron Best, I'm very happy to welcome you. Nice to see you, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Miranda. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you great, yeah.
Great, okay. And it's good to see you again, Miranda. We met a long time ago when you were in Berlin, working and living here, so it's good to see you again. Likewise. So, and thank you very much for your kind invitation to be part of the conversation today. This topic combines two great interests of mine, as well as my biography. From an academic perspective, my background is in environmental economics, and most of my career has been in sort of in the policy world. But I've also worked in the digital sector, originally from Seattle, and in 1997 was hired to work at a small company called Amazon.com, and had a chance to be in one of the front seats at the internet revolution at that time. And thought I was working for a David, but wound up working realized it was a baby Goliath, and realized also my interests are more in the environmental and sustainable worlds. But I've always held this interest in both aspects, so I'm very pleased to be part of that conversation today. So next slide, please. So today I'll be talking about really trying to focus on core principles behind digitalization and sustainability, and I will try to apply those to the climate crisis as well, more concretely, but also a little bit about the nature of digitalization, discourse, and democracy, which I think is very important to be mentioned, and is something that we have not had in the sustainable development debate. Is something, you know, any threats to democracy, you know, was really sort of taken for granted. That was not something we need to worry about. But recent developments point in other directions. So I'll start with an overview of first principles. So this is, we'll cover digitalization, sustainability, and economics, and we'll try to reflect on the nature of things at their core. In digitalization and in programming, if you're from that area, you know, the conversation is of primitives, so like the simplest units, atoms in programming, the core ideas that you bring together to create a program. So you can also, if you're from that sector, you can also think of my presentation now as trying to relate to sort of the primitives that we can combine when we're trying to create a new software for society. So let's start with digitalization. And this has to be one of my favorite all-time sentences in a research paper. 1936, it's Alan Turing. He's 24 years old. And sort of on the bottom of this page, 1/3 into the paper, he has a sentence: "It is possible to invent a single machine which can be used to compute any computable sequence." And this is the big bang of computation. And he goes on in this paper to actually show, to imagine an infinite strip of paper on which you can write symbols. And he goes on to prove mathematically, and I don't understand the rest of the paper, that this is possible. And so I think it's important for us to realize that it is a fundamental attribute of digitalization and computation that these machines can compute any computable sequence, and that we don't know what those sequences will be and become, but that capability is there. Another core principle, and I know many of you are from the sustainable development realm, 1987, the report Our Common Future. And here's where we see the first widely accepted definition of sustainable development. And I'll read it out. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is really the core principle, this idea of intragenerational care and concern combined with this intergenerational fairness that remains at the very, very center of sustainability thinking. Next slide, please. Now let's turn to market economics. And we have Adam Smith. This is in 1759, and he describes for the first time this idea of an invisible hand, sort of marveling at the fact that someone pursuing their own self-interest can wind up doing things that benefit society as a whole, and wind up, sort of this distribution of wealth aspect that comes about through pursuing one's own self-interest. This is the central and most powerful dynamic within market economics. And when markets fail, this is when the invisible hand becomes a very visible failure, and there's this divergence between one's own self-interest and societal interest. And much of environmental economics is about trying to correct those problems. I looked for an image for this slide, and on the right-hand side, this I laugh every time I see it. This is a first edition of Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and I love the fact that the little thing holding the book open is a visible hand. It's this little paperweight. So I thought that was a nice detail I would point out to you. So there's market failures, and the invisible hand has led to a very visible ecological footprint on the Earth. And the ecological footprint was launched in 1990 in my neck of the woods in Canada, in British Columbia. And the idea there and now is, to communicate how many Earths would we need to meet present-day lifestyles. A very powerful device of communication about the true impact of the ways that we're using the biocapacity of the planet. And you can see there the various different lifestyles, the United States being up at the top, needing almost 5 Earths if everyone lives that way, and India down at the bottom with 0.7, and the world average 1.7. And of course, this is just an indicator. It's an estimate. It's a way of thinking and trying to communicate about this that's not completely rigorous, but it's pointing to a clear overshoot of planetary boundaries. And that's where we get to new economic models and ways of communicating about ecological economics. So Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, in 2012 that debuted, and the idea there is to find a way to operate the economy in a safe space for humanity and the planet by not exceeding planetary boundaries. That's the outer part of the circle, the ecological ceiling, while securing the social foundation of our society. So it's that's another highly relevant piece of reading if you're interested in looking more deeply at current thinking in ecological economics. One of my favorite thinkers in ecological economics, Herman Daly, this had the so-called Daly's triangle in his book Toward a Steady State Economy. And that was the idea of extending this sort of intermediate means and ends that we see being the primary focus of economics to thinking about the ultimate means and the ultimate ends. That was expanded by Donella Meadows, where she looked at natural capital, built in human capital, human and social capital, and then the idea of well-being, what's it all for? And I think this is a very useful idea coming out of sustainable development thinking for digitalization thinking. So I've put these questions on the right-hand side. Digitalization for what? What are we trying to achieve in the end? What are our goals? And digitalization from what? And this is also a very, basically what are the resources that are going into it? I mean, these computers don't function just on ether. They consume minerals, energy, there's waste, all these other aspects that are associated with that. And there's the activity that they enable, and that's another impact to think about. So that this full ends means continuum, I think, is another very useful idea. Next slide, please. So let's combine these first principles. From the digitalization side, I think the key thing is that advanced machines will compute any computable sequences. And these are sequences that we can't currently foresee. And it moves quickly, much more quickly than policy can move. So in thinking about policy, we need to anticipate that speed and create the kinds of frameworks that send signals into that very fast moving system. And a system that's ever evolving, so that it evolves in the right kind of direction. Sustainability, go back to first principles. It's all about meeting intergenerational needs now, but also fostering intergenerational fairness and getting that idea into digital communities so that they understand that and so that they're thinking about that is very important. The other thing we need is a multi-dexterous economics. We don't need one invisible hand. We need a set of coordinated hands that can create well-being while respecting healthy limits. And there's a lot of flavors of economics that can help. We have market economics, we have environmental and ecological economics, we have information economics, hugely important in digitalization. Political economics, behavioral economics, also incredibly important now in how digital technologies are using actually the understandings of behavioral economics to manipulate users, and of course ethics as well. You can't forget ethics, which economics has done far too often. Next slide, please. So when we bring these together, what are the core elements of a new economic approach? One has to be addressing the issue of planetary boundaries on the whole, but also environmental limits more locally, addressing market failures, externalities, so that wherever we can have the invisible hand can be put to work to align self-interest and societal interest, and that we send deep signals and steady signals and powerful signals into areas of economic action to give actors incentives to behave in those ways. Absolutely critical in digitalization is the idea of rebound effects. So these are system responses that offset efficiency gains. And I think a fantastic example is there was a US car company that just went public. They had their IPO, Rivian, and their first product, they're developed, they're in the electric vehicle space. And when you think of electric vehicle, you probably have an image of a very efficient small car. Well, theirs is a hugely powerful truck, electric truck that is fast, accelerates as fast as a sports car. And that's a great example of a rebound effect, that the efficiency gain from going electric is turned into attributes that consumers would like, that wind up eating up some of those efficiencies. Price elasticity is also very important to think about, that the responsiveness to prices differs, and that tool needs to be used wisely and with effect. Network effects, very important in the digitalization sector, that market concentration tends to happen. There's winner takes all dynamics. We see that in big tech repeatedly, that these platform effects take place. Out of behavioral economics comes the idea of nudging, guiding behavior in ways that we'd like it to evolve. And this has both a positive side and a shadow side, and needs to be used carefully. Truth, virtue, civility, civics, care, and agency. Why are these things on there? Well, if you look at the conversation today in the platforms that have come about and been enabled well, I think it's clear that we need to make some changes there to ensure that those things, we're all individuals that are made up of many parts ourselves, and we're social animals. We're part of a society, and right now we have companies that are pursuing their own profits and speaking to some of the weaker, less noble aspects of ourselves and as individuals, and leading people down all kinds of strange rabbit holes. So yeah, and that's the last item: pursuit of the good lives by individuals with their communities. And there's an emphasis on lives because people are diverse, and that's one of the things that we need to appreciate and celebrate and foster in healthy ways. Next slide. Okay, so now comes a little riddle. So you've probably seen one of these before. This is a CAPTCHA, and you need to select the square that shows the entity with the most agency. Okay, so the trick is here, is it the smartphone or the person that's the user these days? Who puts in the input and who puts in the output? And the CAPTCHA itself is an example of this, because when we as users complete these CAPTCHAs to get access to whatever we're looking for, we're actually training a machine learning algorithm to see objects in pictures. So who is the user, and who's providing the input and the output? Is it the machine or the human? Next slide. So the great user inversion, I was behind one slide. Look at some of these headings for Senate and House hearings in the United States. Optimizing for engagement, understanding the use of persuasive technology on internet platforms. Americans at risk, manipulation and deception in the digital age. Algorithms and amplification, how social media platforms design choices shape our discourse and our minds. These are incredibly important concerns. And one of the leading thinkers in this area is Tristan Harris from the Center for Humane Technology. highly recommend that you search on his name and look at the analyses of social media and digital business models as a way of understanding the ways that users are being manipulated and as these systemic effects are taking place. And this quote here really sums it up, I think. So, a business model that preys on human attention means that we are worth more as human beings and as citizens of this country when we are addicted, outraged, polarized, narcissistic, and disinformed, because that means that the business model is successful at steering our attention using automation. The business model of everyone getting a chance to speak and have it go viral to millions of people, so long as that is the promise, with personalization, we are each going to be steered into a different rabbit hole of reality. I think it's a fantastic summary of some of the dynamics. Okay, so that's the intermezzo. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to get into some of the details about how digitalization can help or hamper in the climate crisis. And this is based on a paper that you can find and download. It was a policy paper co-authored with Fernando Diaz-Lopez and Massimiliano Massanti for, I think, 2030. And next slide, please. What we cover in that paper are both general topics about digitalization, recent EU developments in terms of both digital and European Green Deal. But we also go into specific topics, looking at some of the developments in Germany, which I think are very interesting, as well as some private sector developments in Italian manufacturing, and also these interactions with COVID pandemic as well as democracy. So that's the quick overview, but I'll get into a few of the relevant details in this presentation. Next slide. So a key thing to say is the future impact of digitalization on our climate is unknown, and there's two global megatrends are going to shape EU policy. They will be central for decades to come. But digitalization, for what and from what, it's such a huge topic, and it's characterized by countervailing effects, unpredictable breakthroughs, and hard to imagine emergent phenomena. And so it's very hard to, in the sum total, to understand what's going on. And it very much depends on the frameworks and the rules of incentives that we create via government. And that's the other reason we don't know the impact of digitalization, because it's not a given. It's a function of what we decide to do and the frame we decide to put it in. Next slide, please. So a brief overview of recent policy. Shaping Europe's digital future and the European Green Deal are sort of the two flagship policies coming together. And this whole conference is about that, so I won't go into detail about it. One thing I do want to say, though, is that I've noticed even in recent digital policies, when I looked on sort of sustainability keywords, they're often used as metaphors rather than the real thing. So you'll often see the word ecosystem in digital communications of the Commission and things like that, but it's an innovation ecosystem or something like that. I've seen it in other things as well. And I think it's worth paying attention to that when you read these documents, and also when you're interacting with the digital community, that these things are not just metaphors. They are real essential systems on which all life depends. Next slide, please. So we have a series of recommendations that we make in the paper, and here's the quick outline. I can see I'm getting close to the end of time. So one is, that digitalization should be embedded, that we need to create the right incentives, that we need to pay attention to the complementarity effects, and I'll be going through these points in turn. Next slide. So what do I mean by embedded digitalization? The idea there is that we should embed digitalization policy within the context of sustainable development, anchor it clearly to the sustainable development goals, and also climate targets and international commitments. And that is a great frame to view any digitalization strategy or policy, is to see if those things are explicitly mentioned, and if the strategy is explicitly seeing itself and finding ways of contributing to those things. Next slide. Right, incentives are, and this is incredibly important. One of the ways that we need to have empathy with each other as individuals is that we're not the same person in every context. And when I was working at Amazon.com, I was very much measured by metrics, had very clear ideas of what I needed to achieve to be successful. Those were defined for me, and they had zero to do with sustainability. And there would have been no way to change my box. There would have been no way to really decide on a different set of priorities. And one of the key things that we need to give individuals is the right signals, consistent signals, so that when they're pursuing metrics within their organizations that make sense for the organization, like the invisible hand, pursuing those metrics is part of pursuing the broader goal in which they're embedded. Next slide. So there's very, very strong complementarity effects between the different policy frameworks, the digitalization and the European Green Deal. And the European Green Deal is fantastic because of it is so systemic, so far-reaching, and because it explicitly acknowledged these sort of transition pathways that are as it takes an evolutionary and transformative approach. It is a fantastic context for bringing in digitalization in a systemic way. Next slide. So in terms of green input and green output, this is that digitalization for what and digitalization from what. So from the materials that go into it, to the energy that's used in processing, to what it's all for. There are opportunities all along that pathway to get digitalization aligned with positive environmental impacts and to reduce the negative ones as well. And it's important to speak about input and output differentially. I mean, the digitalization is this big monolithic thing, but in terms of the digitalization from what, that's a very different conversation set of policies than the digitalization for what. And we should make those distinctions and be precise in our language when we come up with ideas and speak about digitalization. Next slide. Addressing algorithms. I think this is the main topic for tomorrow. It's hugely important. The computation up to now, automation has been able to automate relatively simple and standardized things. What we're going to see with artificial intelligence is that very complex things and shifting things can be automated in ways that they couldn't be before. It's going to have complex systemic effects that we can't anticipate. We're already seeing them. And we need better interdisciplinary work between digitalization and environmental policy communities to figure these things out. And we need to be, from the environmental policy perspective, rather fearless about insisting on being at that table and being in that conversation, despite the fact that artificial intelligence is so complex and so sophisticated that it's a very scary black box for people who don't come from that arena. But just because you don't understand how the black box works doesn't mean you can't talk about what's going in and what's coming out. Next slide. So in terms of responsible governance, it's hugely important that we address a new threat to sustainable development. If we see sustainable development as meeting the needs of current and future generations, one of the things that's hugely important is the quality of our conversation and the ways that we address shared challenges and internationally and within our countries. And we should not allow business models coming out of social media and other disinformation and propaganda effects that are emergent phenomenon of the networks we've created. These erosive dynamics should be addressed in policy. And it's part of, I think, the sustainable development idea that we had taken for granted and need to bring explicitly back, or bring explicitly in. Well, thank you very much. That is my time, and that is the end of my presentation. So I look forward to our conversation, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. And it's really been a pleasure listening to both of your presentations because they complement each other so well. Aaron, with your focus on the problems with the invisible hands, the unintended consequences that have led to big environmental footprints, and then the whole question of how digitalization has become an increasingly important part of our societies, and yet there's so many open areas that still need to be thought about in terms of what needs to be regulated to prevent future problems. How does this relate to democracy? So that fits in so well with where Pallas started us off with a few very nice examples of some of the problems around digitalization if it's not taking into consideration the sustainability goals, the sustainability needs, future generations. And so Pallas, maybe I can start off with you in the first question, and it would really be asking, if we think about Europe and the potentials Europe has to act as a bloc, the potentials for Europe to set standards globally because of its size, and Europe does often take a role as a model. Is it possible for us to set sustainability standards at the European level, or do we have to think much more about differences among societies within Europe, or the differences within sectors? How do we bring this diversity in and yet establish regulations that are going to help us all be protected and sort of create a level playing field?
I think it's a very important question because the instruments I described are not the content, but the way to use it. So, in fact, what I described is, I think, Aaron, it was perfect to see some very ancient books to start with. And I think a lot of the way we look at economy or at democracy is from the 19th century or even before. And it's not good enough anymore. And in a rapid changing environment, we need new instruments. And Aaron just referred to the artificial intelligence. I think we thought that through with coming up with these instruments. It's a hands-on approach in order to be able to have democratic values and laws in the future. And then the question, what's the role of Europe compared to the States? I think a single country cannot make these rules. It's just Europe needs to do this. Of course, we can learn and we can experiment and we can do some things. And for instance, this Airbnb example where Barcelona, Prague, and Amsterdam made this agreement with Airbnb. It perfectly fits in the 19th century, but it does not fit 21st century. It's not good enough. So we really need to come up with new things. And having that, you can create your differences on city levels and nation levels at a European and a global level. And I think Europe needs to take the lead.
All right, thank you, Pallas. And maybe, Aaron, I can get your perspective on this question as well. You were also really mentioning your concerns about also threats to democracy if we don't have the set of rules and frameworks that are necessary to move us in directions that link digital futures with norms that are important to us as a society. How do you see us doing that? What needs to change? What are we not doing enough of right now? Hang on just a minute, Aaron. We don't have your voice.
Yeah, we talk about big tech, But there's also big tech regimes. We look at the United States model, we look at the China model, and we look at the European model, basically, so far, of big tech regimes. And I think each of those, you know, the EU has the opportunity, it's large enough from an economic perspective to throw its weight around and to create a context that and some rules for if you want to play in the EU market, then you need to, you know, and the data privacy is, you know, a clear example of that, and where I think the EU has shown its leadership, and yeah, so I think the EU can prioritize some of these policy issues in sustainability as part of that, clearly, and with good effect as well. And in terms of the democracy aspect, also there, I think the critical lens. It's not just I use the U.S. example of the Senate hearings and the House hearings, but the EU also is taking a very critical look at some of these platforms and their effects on discourse. So.
Yeah, so I think that's one really important element that we started the discussion, discourse and how that impacts us. And then a second thing that I got out of your presentations that had me thinking, we see ourselves moving more and more in the direction of using artificial intelligence, robotics, digitalization, and we know that there's a big energy demand behind it. We also know that we're looking at digitalization as a solution for a lot of our energy challenges and the transition to a climate neutral European Union. Can you help us think through that a little bit? The pros, the cons, and how can we make sure that as we move more into a digital future, we're not actually causing ourselves a lot of rebound problems or driving energy demand in new ways that were actually not intended. How do we deal with this?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways the term digitalization is a disservice to thinking, into thought, because it's too big. It's so broad. It's pervasive and everywhere. And that's why, as I was preparing my presentation, this distinction between digitalization for what and digitalization from what is a very clean separation of those issues. You know, how can we make it efficient? This sort of the from what, but then also its effects aspect, and to try to think precisely about those things. I'm not saying that those terms are maybe the best ones to use, but we need that sort of precision to come into the language so that we can speak precisely and not get scared by kind of this big amorphous, huge thing that you don't know where to start, you know.
Well, I have a different opinion. Of course, this is true what you say, but this is not solving the issue. If you look at making of steel, and you compare it to digitization, we use more energy for steel than for digitization. So, but still it's a lot and it will grow. So it's about, well, it depends on how you calculate, but it's 3 to 5% of the total energy the usage is used for digital aspect. And there is a kind of end of line of the technological development, because we still use copper for transporting the data, and also in the service, and there is a limit to it. So we've been growing very fast in the last 50 years or so, but the energy demand hasn't grown at the same speed. On the contrary, it has been done very well. But still, we have some real issues, especially as an example for the Amsterdam area, the data centers. Because of their efficiency becoming larger and larger, and like 5 years ago, it was one data center has the same energy demand as a mid-sized city, and now we see data centers with the energy demand equal to Amsterdam, and not just one, but a whole series of them. And this energy efficiency thinking creates a new type of problem, because you cannot put it in a network anywhere. You cannot put 7 Amsterdams in a network that was developed for only one of them. And the energy transition is going on as well. So we need to come up with completely different perspectives. Not well, one of them, of course, is technological development, because well, you can use photonics and quantum computing and all kind of changes that will come up. But it's also about rearranging and another part is, well, we use computers for 3 years and then throw them away and start anew. We can do that very much better. So if you just don't focus too much on energy efficiency, you will use less energy because you won't throw them away after 3 years. And then you can use, well, I said in my presentation, while developing software, there is no metric for how green it is. And so if we add that, a lot of things will happen. And the second one, if you look at it also from where to use the servers, for instance, or the edge computing. For instance, this machine learning will take a lot of energy, not only in the example of where you are asked to train a machine, but it's a computing which needs a lot of energy. So why do we use the servers at the most important places like in Amsterdam or Frankfurt? And instead, you can create a data center in the middle of the sea with the windmills around it to provide the energy for it. And this different type of thinking will help a lot. So we need to be more open for new type of solutions. And if we do that, then I think we can still keep it at 5% of the total energy demand, but also find better ways to implement it in the existing networks.
You know, Pallas, something that Aaron said that I thought was great. Instead of calling the need for the invisible hand, because we have such a visible hand of the market, what we actually need are coordinated hands. And what I really liked about that is it was talking about what you're saying here. We really need people who are looking at these issues from very diverse perspectives so that we, in a sense, shock our ways of thinking. We push ourselves out of the boxes that we're all living in and try to look across and see other dimensions that may help us to really use the emerging technologies in ways that are primarily helping us move forward and not bringing a whole lot of new problems with them. So what I really liked about your discussions is you're saying we need to be thinking in new ways and we need to be talking with each other. So I'll give you both one last word. If you want to advise the councils that are listening here or the many students that are listening to our discussion, what would be the one or two things that you would say to them? These are the next steps. These are the things that really need to happen now. And let's start with Pallas.
I think, well, this perspective of we need to redefine society from this digital, but the way the digital society works in terms of democracy, in terms of services delivered, in terms of how industries are coordinated, multidextrous. So take the challenge, go for it. It's not easy, but we need to start.
Thank you. And Aaron?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of an unequal relationship between sustainable development and digitalization in terms of the level of knowledge that the communities have of each other. I think because all of us are digital users and consumers, you know, even working in environmental fields, we have kind of an exposure to that. And I think that those working in digital fields, there needs to be a bit more of an equal relationship. And so if we can find ways of getting that environmental thinking, sustainable thinking deeper into digital communities, and words like ecosystems stop being just metaphors, but become, you know, actually referring to the thing itself, that could be very healthy. And I think there's really, you know, I spoke about principles, but there are very concrete challenges ahead, and we need experts that can understand and get into the details on these issues. For example, Web3 is supposedly coming, and it's going to be blockchain enabled, and blockchain is running on proof of work algorithms that are consuming huge amounts of energy. What are the options there? And we need experts that can really think through that and figure out, okay, we're going to have blockchain, but how can we build it on an architecture that doesn't require people to solve endless quantities of mathematical problems, to keep the ledger working. So yeah, I guess that would be it.
Nice final comments there. And just to let you know, there's some great comments from the audience saying how much they liked your presentations, and you actually managed to kind of speak to the questions they were asking in your responses just now. So thank you both very much. I think to keep time, I have to end this discussion and move us forward to our next presentation. So thanks for joining us, and we hope for more inputs in the future.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye.
so thanks. And now I would like to move over to our next speaker, Peter Schmidt, who is president of the Environmental and Agricultural section of the European Economic and Societal Committee, and also was rapporteur for their exploratory opinion, Digitalization, Sustainability, and the Connection to Civil Society. So we are happy to have Peter Schmidt joining us with a presentation of several minutes, and then we will also have time for more discussion. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, and thank you very much for this kind invitation to join your today's meeting. My name is Peter Schmidt. I'm the current president of the so-called NAT section of the European Economic and Social Committee. If you allow, I would like to make you a bit familiar with the EEAC. The EEAC is a consultative body in the EU. It's written already in the Roman treaties. We are composed on three groups: the employers groups, the trade unions. I come from the trade union group, and the group of various interests. And we have 329 members all over Europe. And what we are doing is we produce opinions, and the power of the EEAC is to find meaningful compromises on different areas. In this specific case, I, for instance, was rapporteur on an opinion on the digitalization and sustainability. And the question today is it a twin challenge, or are these two challenges? The answer is quite easy and confusing. It is both. Why is it both? It is both because it is probably one of the biggest challenges what we are facing or are faced in the last decades, apart from the COVID crisis. So what do we need in order to organize this digital greening of the economy and the society? We need different approaches. We need an integrated approach. That's why we appreciate that the Commission has launched this approach. But for that we need much more, rather than just bring some elements onto the table. One important element is the involvement of the civil society, and structured involvement of the civil society. We have to take the people with us, otherwise this transition won't happen. The second very, very important element is that the social dialogue must be fostered, because we're gonna have winners, but we will also have some losers in this project, and for that we need the employers and the trade unions in order to organize the transition. And the third important element is that one of the basic skills will be the digital and green skills in the future. And for this as well, we have to adjust or adapt the vocational training schemes across Europe. If we don't do that, we do not have the people then properly educated for this digital transition. So that's why we think it is a necessary step that we come to this transition. And for us as EEAC, and since I'm the president of the NUT section dealing with rural development, we think one of the key elements must be have a specific focus on the balanced development of rural areas. We think this is the backbone of this transition, because if we do not foster this, then we will leave people behind. And when we leave people behind, we saw in the past which consequences this can have. That's why we say specifically we have to foster small and medium enterprises. They must have specific help. They do not have the resources like big multinationals. They must have the help of associations, but especially from the EU and from the different governments. So we as EEAC, we say the key word of the transition is well-being. We organized an opinion on the well-being economy, and that's why we think well-being combined with a digital green transition is the right way to come to a climate neutral future. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Those were some really important reminders to us from Peter Schmidt, focusing not only on the urban but also on the rural communities, understanding the need for a well-being society, and trying to think about the kinds of technical skills that we need to help people develop in order to be part of this new society, and also the role of small and medium enterprises who don't often have the number of people, the financial capacity to do this on their own. We need to think of ways to help these communities join us in this digital transformation, or the sustainable digital transformation. I am happy to now welcome Torfinn Steinfort, who will be joining us in our discussion with some discussion about the green transformation and sustainability within the European context, and thinking about some of the measures that are being taken in Europe along the lines of the Green Deal or the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. So we're happy to welcome Torfinn Steinfort here to join us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Good morning. So nice to have you here. And we're really looking forward to this discussion about the regulatory frameworks and plans that are being developed within the European Union, also at a time when we're facing multiple crises. We have Corona, and the numbers are going back in the wrong direction, and people are worried. And then there's the question of inflation and where are we going? We have climate change. How do we, within the European context, deal with these issues? How are we using the recovery plan to move forward with digitalization and sustainability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, these are indeed big questions at the moment, and I think right now we're at an inflection point for these issues that we're talking about this morning. Both digitalization and sustainability are obviously high on the agenda at the moment, and highlighted by the crisis we've been through because of COVID, which is highlighting even more than ever the importance of digital society, and of course in the context of the Green Deal, which was already the priority of the Commission, and as we all know, continues to be an imminent threat. So one of the most important aspects of this is, of course, the national recovery and resilience plans that have been created by all member states. And this represents one of the most important policy tools to combine these two areas that we're talking about this morning, these twin challenges, because in the plans, member states are required to allocate at least 37% of the funding to climate and 20% to digital initiatives. So you can see that obviously means that a large portion of the spending will be moving directly into these areas we're talking about this morning. And obviously the hope would be that we can really use that opportunity to build a sustainable digital infrastructure in Europe. But unfortunately, I think that this is an opportunity that is not fully being realized because, as we've discussed about this morning, I mean, digitalization and sustainability can also move slightly in parallel and potentially be even somewhat contradictory to each other. And I think that that's a bit more the direction we see as things stand in the NRRPs, as they call them. One problem is that these plans have had to be prepared very, very quickly. Of course, it was a very urgent situation. We're addressing a crisis, and perhaps not as much strategic thought and planning has been put in as could have been ideal. So we've seen in a lot of countries that there is a lot of good initiatives maybe, but they're not as well coordinated as possible. And we've seen that the linkage of digitalization and sustainability is quite weak, more or less across the board. In fact, digitalization, as we've been talking about, I think Peter Schmidt mentioned about the well-being economy and how important it is to use digitalization for an end and not as for a means, not an end. And I don't think we see that so much. We do see occasional good initiatives, but in general, digitalization is treated more as an end than a means. One interesting notable exception is perhaps in Poland, which perhaps surprises some, that they've done quite a good job of integrating digitalization horizontally. But unfortunately for the topic today, not so much with environment, but across some other areas that has been better done. What we also see is that very few countries are really grappling with issues around just transition and digitalization. That could have been a good approach, but it's not so much been used. Nor do we see much incorporation of circular economy concepts and digitalization. Again, sort of a bit more of an old approach towards just waste processing, as opposed to moving into a more circular economy. I think maybe that's as an overview of the NRRPs. I think that's a good place to leave it.
Okay, thanks very much for that. But I want to see if I can take you a little bit further with that discussion about the national recovery programs, because that is very much where we are right now. And if I think about it, I have seen some pretty amazing transitions in the last year and a half during the Corona times, where all of us have learned how to use tools that we hadn't had any exposure to in the past. We've become a much more virtual world in a very short time. We've also seen a lot of new apps being developed. So we do see changes happening here. And I'm wondering, you mentioned several problems, that the national recovery programs aren't doing enough yet in a lot of areas, but maybe you can give us a little bit of hope and tell us, are there areas where we have seen some improvements? Are we seeing the national recovery programs taking some steps in the direction that make us even a little bit more climate friendly or sustainable?
Mm-hmm. Well, the plans, I think, do have good elements in terms of sustainability. I mean, there is supposed to be 37% of spending on climate. So even if, as a side note, there's potentially some concern about how is that 37% going to be calculated. But in any case, yes, there are good initiatives. I mean, you see investments into public transit. And within that, I think that you have also seen, for example, some digital tools being planned. You see digital tools being being rolled out. And you do see that in some sectors, like the healthcare sector, for example. A lot of countries have planned digitalization initiatives in healthcare. But I think the problem for me is that there's not a lot of thinking about digitalization, either really using digital tools for sustainability. There may be some here and there, but it's not a broadly based movement, let's say. So that's the problem there, in my view. There is an interesting report, in case people are interested to look into these issues with regard to how much systemic change is being promoted by the plans created by the Zoe Institute. I forget the exact title, but it's basically National Recovery Plans and Systemic Change. And there's a lot of interesting examples in there of particular tools being deployed in different countries.
Mm-hmm. So thanks for that. We'll see if we can find that report and share it also with the reviewers, the viewers out there. Maybe you can also help us think a little bit about some of the other initiatives that we have going on in Europe. So the National Recovery Plans, that's an emergency response to an emergency situation. And the fact that they have not yet so well integrated just transition concerns and sustainability concerns clearly is partly because it had to be brought up in the shortest of time. But we also have the Green Deal. We also have other initiatives, and maybe you can help us understand a bit more about where you see change happening, but also where we see the need for paying more attention to whatever that might be, integration, bringing in the voice of citizens. But let's start with what are some of the other areas of change you see?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So this is a very big area. I mean, it's hugely complex, and we're talking about a lot of different aspects of digitalization. Of course, we're talking about both making sure that existing digitalization is as sustainable as it can be, and also using digitalization to promote sustainability. So there's two sort of related but completely separate tracks in a sense. And as we've mentioned, I mean, it interlinks with all other aspects of society and politics and economics. So it's a bit hard to really boil it down. But nonetheless, I will try to mention some of the most important areas that I see. We've seen, of course, since the Green Deal was proposed in 2019 by the von der Leyen Commission, a lot of initiatives coming out in terms of both sustainability and digitalization, these sort of two tracks. And what I think is one interesting remark to begin with is that I think that this is really the beginning, at least at European level, of a real attempt to grapple with this question of how do you deal with both of them, not as separate questions, but try to bring them together and to really address the sustainability implications of digitalization and the digital implications of sustainability. So some of it is still a little bit embryonic phase and still, I think, being put together. So I think that it's fair to say that is the case. And when we maybe criticize a little bit some aspects of it, I think it's also fair to remember that this is relatively new on the policy agenda, and it takes time to really sort together to make sure that there is a coherent approach. That said, there is some, I think, still some confusion. There's a lot, as I say, there's so many initiatives. There's a lot going on. It can be a little bit confusing for both civil society. I mean, I speak fairly often with other civil society groups, and even quite well-informed actors are not completely aware of what's going on across the board horizontally in terms of all of the different initiatives and how do they fit together and what is really the strategy behind all of them necessarily. So I think that's something that can hopefully be a little bit sorted out as we go forward. I think it's also worth noting, I'll come back to this maybe later, but the implementation continues always to be an issue. I mean, it's all very nice to have the ideas and the plans in place, but if they're not being implemented at member state level, they're not very useful. So that's another issue. So there's a lot of proposals, some of which deal with fairly specific proposals to develop tools in a particular area or thematic approach. Like under the farm to fork strategy, there are proposals to develop digital records for fishing, more tracking of food products through the cycle of growing food and selling food and the disposal of the waste. But then there's also these sort of very big picture initiatives, some of which were discussed yesterday in this session by the Commission, that are going to be dealing in the really big picture about how to regulate digitalization for sustainability and for our society more broadly, in terms of some of these issues that also Aaron alluded to in terms of democracy and economic concentrations, and these are very important issues, as well as sustainability. And I think here particularly about the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Data Governance Act, and the AI regulation. Now, these are new initiatives that are dealing with quite big problems, and that include the issues, some of these issues that we've mentioned with regard to environmental sustainability. And that includes, the gatekeepers, the big companies that control a lot of our digital space, that this is a new sort of power dynamic that we haven't dealt with before in this exact way. And these, particularly the Digital Markets Act, try to grapple with that without very specifically getting into environmental issues. I'd say that this is one of the things that does stand out, is that they're not particularly focused on the environment. And you could say that this is a weakness, I think. I mean, it's not that they can't deal with some of these environmental issues through their other provisions, but there's not a lot of focus on this. And I think, for example, of the AI regulation, which I think you'll get into more tomorrow, but I do note that it only very tangentially deals with the environment, despite the very strong environmental implications of AI. As we were discussing earlier, the sort of very potentially large energy usage of AI is not really addressed in there. And I think that's something that we should really be thinking about. It's also true that perhaps at the moment there's not a strong consensus on how to do that. So it needs to be developed, but that's something that does need absolutely, I think, to be integrated now. And you have some groups, for example, Algorithm Watch, who are developing sustainability criteria for AI, environmental sustainability criteria, in terms of there are different aspects in terms of energy usage, but also, of course, in terms of the outcomes of the AI and how is it used, which will become a bigger and bigger issue that we need to deal with. And so I think that's something that needs to be more carefully considered. You saw also one overarching aspect that the Commission recently published the 2030 Digital Compass, which is supposed to be a strategy document laying out the direction of digital policy. But again, here, I think you see a lot of focus on the means and not so much the ends to me. You don't see much focus on environmental sustainability there. The only mention really is that data centers should become climate neutral by 2030. But it's not really integrated into the strategy that the ultimate aim in integration with the Green Deal is for a more sustainable society, climate neutral society overall. And how do we use digitalization in that direction? It seems to be more directed toward, to some extent, using digitalization as an end in itself. You see a lot of targets for increasing deployment of digitalization. But as we also alluded to before, I mean, digitalization can also include a lot of rebound effects that mean that it shouldn't be assumed that it's necessarily always a sort of a net plus in the way that it is in those documents. And you see really in the documents a strong push for continued rapid digitalization. Also, despite the fact that we still, as it was also mentioned previously, that there's a very rapid deployment of data servers and this kind of energy intensive infrastructure that is not, we don't have a full control on making those more energy efficient, and the deployment is rapidly outstripping our energy efficiency. So the sort of emphasis on the growth of digital infrastructure, I think, is also not necessarily in line with a sort of a sustainable approach to digitalization. So those are some broad outlines that I see.
Thanks, Thornfinn. This was a good overview of the need for more sustainability thinking in a very rapidly emerging field. And of course, many people have mentioned when we say the word digitalization, it covers such a very broad spectrum of activities that it makes it even difficult to know what we're talking about here. But if we just take the aspect of computing and the energy demands that come from supercomputing, that this is in fact an area we need to do a lot more thinking about, but also other areas. And I think you mentioned a couple other things that I thought were really important in your presentation. One is that a lot of our thinking right now has just focused on what I would simplify as saying efficiency improvements. How can we use digitalization to make some steps towards a somewhat better use of energy or resources? But we haven't done enough yet to think about the just transition, and we haven't done enough about the circular economy perspective, and how do we really think through from cradle to grave, and rather than have cradle and grave, cradle to cradle, where we really are looking at material and energy use in a much more sustainable, circular fashion. And there's a further aspect that you've hinted at, but it's the participatory aspect and bringing the voice of citizens in. I'm wondering, you said you wanted to speak a bit more about implementation. I'm wondering if this is an area where bringing citizens into the discussion would help. Could we develop governance structures that are more participatory and help us think through these very complex questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a good question. And in fact, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I'm working on a project actually right now where we're discussing with civil society groups about how to use digital tools to enhance participation of citizens in decision making, because as we've seen, for example, during the COVID crisis, a lot of the sort of traditional methods of participation have been disrupted, and we've had to move to a more digital approach to participation and consultation. Yeah, for the moment, I think it's still a little bit at the infancy a little bit. I mean, they've put consultations online and you can reply, but maybe there are some other more engaging participatory tools that we can use. I mean, you do see, for example, citizens' assemblies being used more and more now in different countries. We've seen that in Ireland and France, for example, as ways of engaging citizens. And I think that there's some good potential there. And I think that it's definitely something that is needed now, especially as we move into this much more fundamental transformation, both in terms of sustainability. I don't think we should sugarcoat in a way how much there will be some disruptions potentially in the future, and we need citizen engagement and buy-in because of that, and also because of all these digital tools that we've been discussing and new technologies.
And the other aspect of participation within the European context would be the question of national governments and regional governments. We understand that capacities are quite different from country to country in this area. When you are looking at this at a European level and thinking about this multi-level, multi-governance perspective, what can we do to forward this process at the national level so that this integration at the European level can also be improved?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I would say is that, I mean, implementation does continue to lag in a lot of areas. So I think that's still, I mean, it sounds very basic, but it is a very important thing that is often discussed, that certain regulations exist already at EU level to cover these kind of, material implications of digitalization, but are very poorly implemented in many member states. For example, the waste from electrical and electronic equipment directive, and so that's one aspect. I mean, you do also, just broadly speaking, I think that member states are very important partners. Of course, as mentioned also earlier, the European level, we need to bring these questions together. These are questions that cannot be handled by individual member states, but we do need absolutely engagement from each member state across the continent, no matter their level of development and so on. And you do also see, for example, cities. Many cities are very innovative in this space in terms of developing digital regulations around AI and sustainability, and pioneering new tools and new rules around because it's often at the city level that you really engage in terms of these tools like Uber or Airbnb, as mentioned earlier. That's where the implications are, and you do see a lot of innovation in that space.
It's very nice you said that. Just yesterday, I was teaching a class in the evening with my master's students, and we were talking about the smart city, because when we are thinking about urbanization and trends towards greater urbanization in the future, and the energy and resource demands of cities, this is really an area where we could see some very useful contributions with greater use of digitalization. So your emphasis here on implementation, I think, is key. And when I think about what was just happening with the climate negotiations in Glasgow, where we had some steps forward in terms of trying to keep the world at a 1.5 degree temperature maximum increase. And we saw big pushes towards more focus on renewables and transitions away from fossil fuels. I think we're seeing some progress, but the big question now will be, how do we implement? The targets are being set, the goals are being made clear and stronger, but implementation. So I think what you've really highlighted for us here is our need to bring these two areas much more strongly together, and not only recognize that digitalization is there as an opportunity, but it's also something that we need to build the capacity to make it happen. And what I also liked with Peter Schmidt's focus on not just the urban but the rural area, and you also mentioned the farm to fork strategy. I think that's also really important for us to think about. How do we make this a just transition that happens across different regions of the entire complex European regions, and developing countries that will also need to assist in making this transition. Do you have any last words for us, Tornfinn?
Yeah, maybe I would just mention a couple of other things. I think that one other issue to think about is that the EC still also presents digitalization as explicitly a sort of a growth-oriented strategy as well, but also a sustainability strategy. And I think that it's worth also thinking about the sort of relationship there and the what that implies. I mean, there's of course a lot of controversy and debate about economic growth versus economic sustainability and how much you can have them coexisting, or the degree to which they're contradictory. But you know, whatever you're thinking about that, I think it's just interesting to note that the Commission still has this sort of approach of digitalization. There's no contradiction. It's very rarely acknowledged, let's say, that there's a contradiction between really rapid digitalization and sustainability. I mean, they focus very much on the benefits and not on the sort of contradictions and potential problems. As you mentioned also, I think it's also certainly notable that there's not a lot of discussion about the sort of just transition issues in digitalization, because you do have a lot of disruption potentially coming from AI and other automation tools in the next 10 to 20 years. I guess this will become a very, very serious problem, depending on what direction that goes, and that's something that needs to be already starting to be planned, I think. And I think, yeah, broadly speaking, also obviously you just need to place it into a broader context of digital of the Green Deal. I mean, it's a systematic approach we need. It cannot just be digitalization. I mean, we do need a view that takes care of the whole picture, so that we can avoid rebound effects. I mean, that's always a problem, and has been until now demonstrated that rebound effects have sort of overwhelmed, generally speaking, the whatever benefits there have come from digitalization, even if they are substantial as well. So I think that just needs to be considered, and that, for example, should include issues around green taxation, making polluter pay, and that is very relevant, I think, in the digital space in terms of who is using this computer power, who ultimately is benefiting from it. We see a lot of concentration of the benefits in large industry or large companies that we all know, and figuring out a way to make them, you know, to apply the polluter pays principle correctly in this context, I think is also a big part of the picture. And somewhat related, we need to really invest into the public sector's ability to understand this question. I think right now it's not fully understood. There's not a lot of capacity in a lot of governments at EU level and at member state level to grapple with these issues, which, as we've mentioned, are very complicated and you know, can be very technical and legally complicated in terms of how you control these processes and keeping up with the developments, which are, as we all know, very rapid. So those are some important points, I think, to highlight, broadly speaking. I might just mention here at the end that the IEP is running an online stakeholder forum for people who are interested in issues around digitalization and sustainability, and environmental rights. So discussing also issues around just transition and environmental rights more broadly. So anyone who's interested, please contact IEP, and yeah, we'd be happy to hear from you. And I've been very happy to participate today and to listen to the very interesting presentations.
Tornfinn, thank you so very much. And you really did a nice wrap up for us here in terms of saying when we do this digital transformation, we really need to slow down and think a little bit. We need to understand what kinds of government regulations, frameworks, and oversight we need of this whole process. We need to be thinking about how to bring in different perspectives, polluter pays principles, so that when damage is being caused by this transition, that those who are causing it are also responsible for it. And what we also heard earlier this morning, that in many ways what we need is a precautionary approach. We need to be thinking early on, as digitalization will be taking off in rapid speed in the years ahead, even more so than it has done in the last few years. We need to be prepared for how to steer it in a direction that takes us where we want to go, rather than be steered in directions where we're saying, oh no, what have we done here? Very, very nice discussion with you. Thanks so much for joining us today. And we're actually hitting the time when I need to wrap up here. We have had a really excellent day of discussion. This morning has focused attention on digitalization, both as an opportunity, but also as an area where perhaps we also need to be thinking about some of the footprints that digitalization can bring with it, and that we need to be developing a digital transformation that is participatory, bringing in different sectors, that is bringing in different community voices, and also really recognizing that digitalization is something that will have a lot of positive implications, but also potentially some negative ones if we don't plan early, and if we don't really take a broad perspective and a broad look at what some of the unintended consequences of digitalization might be. Tomorrow we will be continuing our discussion here at this annual conference of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Councils. Tomorrow we have a big and exciting roundtable that we will be organizing, and we are looking forward to seeing you back here again at 9:30 in the morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. We had a lot of viewers, and we are very happy to have you with us. Thank you.